Are you interested in angels, demons, ghosts, spirits, and monsters? Are you curious about their origins, tales, and influence upon history and on the present day? If so, then sit back, relax, and welcome to Southern Demonology, the podcast that explores all of this and more.
Hello all, and welcome to the very first episode of Season 7. And we're kicking things off with a bang this year. And as I'm sure that you've already recognized by this point, not only do we have an updated logo, but there's even brand new theme music. But I have a much bigger announcement to start things off, and that is that I have finally started working on the book that I have been wanting to write for at least the past 15 years, entitled The Grammar of the Unseen, a Demonology Rooted in Text and Tradition. The book will look at demonology from the ancient Near East to the present day. In fact, during my time off over the holiday season and between season 6 and now the start of 7, I have completed not only the introduction for the entire book, but I've even gotten most of the opening chapters finished out. And today, I wanted to share the introduction of that book with you all. So, sit back, relax, and welcome to the beginning of The Grammar of the Unseen. Why demonology still matters. Demonology occupies an uneasy position within modern scholarship. It is frequently dismissed as a vestige of pre-scientific cosmology, sensationalized in popular culture, or treated with undue fascination divorced from historical rigor. Yet the persistence of demonological concepts across cultures, textual traditions, and historical periods suggest that they address enduring questions about evil, agency, and human vulnerability that cannot be reduced to mere superstition. As such, demonology warrants careful, methodologically responsible study rather than reflexive rejection or uncritical acceptance. This book approaches demonology not as an exercise in speculation, but rather as a historical and theological inquiry into how ancient communities conceptualized hostile, non-human intelligences and structured responses to them. In the ancient Near East, the Mediterranean world, and Second Temple Judaism, demons were not abstract symbols, but intelligences understood to operate within defined constraints. These beings were neither omnipotent nor autonomous. They existed within ordered cosmologies that emphasized limitation, hierarchy, and accountability. The modern tendency to portray demons as either fictional monsters or near omnipotent forces represents a significant departure from ancient sources. Biblical texts, in particular, exhibit a notable restraint. References to unclean spirits, adversarial beings, or harmful entities are sparse, deliberate, and embedded within broader theological frameworks. The Hebrew Bible avoids detailed demonological speculation, while later Second Temple literature develops a more explicit explanation without abandoning the assumption that such beings remain subordinate to divine authority. The emergence of structured demonology during the Second Temple period constitutes a critical development, often overlooked in contemporary discourse. Texts such as First Enoch, Jubilees, and the sectarian writings from Qumran articulate origins, functions, and limitations of demons with increasing clarity. These texts also demonstrate a growing concern with communal protection, moral discipline, and spiritual vigilance rather than ritual experimentation. The demonic is framed not as an object of fascination, but as a threat to be mitigated through obedience, prayer, and communal order. This historical context is essential for understanding the New Testament portrayal of demons and exorcism. The Gospels presuppose a demonological worldview already familiar with their audiences. Jesus' exorcisms are not presented as novel techniques, but as demonstrations of authority that decisively reframe the relationship between hostile spirits and humanity. The emphasis consistently falls on command, prohibition, and expulsion rather than engagement or negotiation. A central concern of this book is methodological restraint. Demonology has often suffered from excess, whether through speculative reconstructions, overconfident systematization, or modern attempts to operationalize ancient beliefs. The sources themselves caution against such approaches. Knowledge of hostile spirits is never presented as protective in itself. On the contrary, fascination and unauthorized engagement are repeatedly portrayed as sources of danger. Accordingly, this work does not attempt to provide a comprehensive catalog of demons, ritual procedures, or practical techniques for confrontation. Such material, while common in modern treatments, finds little support in the historical record and often reflects later accretions or popular distortions. Instead, the emphasis here is on spiritual literacy, understanding how ancient communities recognized spiritual threat, distinguished it from psychological or moral affliction, and structured lives intended to minimize vulnerability. This study proceeds on the assumption that demonology, when responsibly framed, serves as a defensive rather than exploratory function. It clarifies boundaries, reinforces moral and communal order, and situates evil within a constrained cosmology that resists both paranoia and denial. Demons in the ancient worldview are neither imaginary nor ultimate. They are real but limited, hostile but constrained, and ultimately subject to judgment. The relevance of demonology, therefore, does not lie in the demons themselves, but in what their study reveals about how communities understood evil without surrendering to it. To study demonology is not to magnify darkness, but to illuminate the structures, ethical, theological, and communal, that prevent darkness from becoming sovereign. The structure and argument of this book. This book proceeds deliberately and cumulatively. Demonology, as treated here, is not approached as a self-contained system, but as a historical discourse that develops over time in response to theological, cultural, and communal pressures. This section builds upon the previous one, not by expanding speculation, but by narrowing focus and clarifying boundaries. The order of presentation is therefore essential to the argument as a whole. The opening section establishes the ancient foundations upon which later demonological concepts were constructed. Rather than beginning with fully developed systems, the book starts with the cosmologies of the ancient Near East and the restrained treatment of hostile spirits in the Hebrew Bible. This approach resists the common temptation to read later ideas retroactively into earlier texts. By grounding the discussion in its earliest context, the reader is provided with the conceptual vocabulary necessary to understand how demons were differentiated from gods, spirits, and ancient forces, and why Israelite theology consistently resisted demonological excess. From this foundation, the book turns to the Second Temple period, which represents the most significant development in Jewish demonological thought. This section traces how earlier ambiguities were addressed through narrative expansion, particularly in texts concerned with the origin, nature, and limitations of hostile spirits. Special attention is given to the Watcher tradition, the emergence of named adversarial figures, and the increasing emphasis on communal protection. This material functions as the interpretive bridge between the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament, without which the latter's assumptions about demons and exorcism remain incomplete. The subsequent section examines the New Testament within its inherited demonological framework. Rather than treating Jesus' exorcisms and apostolic language as isolated phenomena, this book situates them within the expectations already present in late Second Temple Judaism. The focus here is not on technique, but on authority, how command replaces confrontation, and how spiritual conflict is reframed as a matter of allegiance and lordship rather than power competition. This section also addresses common modern misunderstandings by distinguishing possession, oppression, and affliction as they appear in the text themselves. Having established the historical and theological contours of demonology, the book then turns to classification and behavior, not as a systematizing exercise, but as a way of identifying patterns consistently attested across sources. These chapters examine what hostile spirits are portrayed as doing, what they seek, and how they interact with individuals and environments. Importantly, this material is presented descriptively rather than prescriptively. The goal is recognition, not engagement, and clarity rather than completeness. The final sections address exorcism, spiritual defense, and modern misapplication. Here, the book deliberately slows its pace, emphasizing restraint and warning against overconfidence. Historical practices are evaluated critically, modern distortions are named directly, and the ethical responsibilities of demonological discourse are foregrounded. The work concludes by returning to its central claim, that demonology, when responsibly studied, is ultimately concerned less with demons than with the preservation of order, humility, and discernment. Taken as a whole, the structure of this book reflects its guiding conviction that understanding hostile spiritual forces requires context, patience, and limits. Readers are encouraged to resist the urge to read selectively or out of sequence. Demonology reveals its coherence only when approached as a disciplined inquiry, rather than as a collection of isolated curiosities. The path traced here is intentional, and deviation from it risks reproducing the very misunderstandings that this work seeks to correct. Southern Demonology and the transition to podcast to text. In April of 2017, the podcast Southern Demonology began its life as an audio-based inquiry into the historical, textual, and theological foundations of angelology and demonology. From its inception, the podcast sought to resist two dominant trends in the modern treatments of the subject: sensationalism and reductionism. Rather than dramatizing dramatic or dismissing them as purely psychological artifacts, the series adopted a historically grounded approach that privileged primary sources, especially ancient text, and emphasized interpretive restraint. The podcast format allowed for exploratory engagement with complex material while maintaining an accessible tone, but it also imposed inherent limitations on depth, structure, and sustained argumentation. The decision to adapt Southern Demonology into a book reflects both the strengths and constraints of the audio medium. Podcasts excel at introducing ideas, tracing thematic connections, and modeling interpretive caution in real time. However, demonology as a subject benefits from sustained analysis, cross-referencing, and careful sequencing, features that are difficult to fully realize in episodic audio form. The transition from print allows for a more deliberate organization of material, enabling arguments to be developed cumulatively rather than episodically, and permitting readers to engage with the subject at their own pace and depth. Importantly, this book is not a transcript or anthology of podcast episodes. While it draws upon the same research trajectory and intellectual commitments, the written format necessitates a different methodological posture. Oral presentation tolerates a degree of repetition, digression, and provisional framing that written scholarship does not. In converting spoken analysis into text, arguments have been tightened, claims more explicitly qualified, and sources more rigorously cited. Where the podcast often gestured toward broader scholarly conversations, the book is positioned to engage them directly and transparently through formal documentation. The podcast to book transition also serves a clarifying function with respect to audience and intent. Audio media frequently attracts listeners whose interests range from academic curiosity to personal experience and popular horror. While this diversity is not inherently problematic, it can create ambiguity regarding the purpose of demonological discussion. This volume seeks to resolve that ambiguity by explicitly situating itself within the domain of historical and theological inquiry. It is written for readers willing to engage critically with sources, to tolerate uncertainty when evidence is limited, and to resist the impulse to extrapolate practice from description. A further motivation for the transition lies in the ethical responsibilities associated with demonological discourse. Throughout the history of the subject, poorly contextualized material has contributed to fear, superstition, and in some cases, real harm. The podcast format, while effective for warning against these dangers, does not always necessarily allow for the sustained framing necessary to prevent misapplication. A book, by contrast, provides space for repeated boundary setting, methodological clarification, and explicit discouragement of unauthorized experimentation. In this sense, the move to print represents not an expansion of engagement, but a tightening of scope. Finally, this transition reflects a broader commitment to intellectual accountability. Podcasts are ephemeral by nature. They are consumed, shared, and often forgotten without leaving a stable scholarly trace. A book invites scrutiny, citation, and disagreement in ways that audio media rarely does. By committing the arguments of Southern Demonology to print, this work enters a longer academic conversation, one that values precision over provocation and understanding over immediacy. The goal is not to elevate the project beyond its origins, but to render its core commitments more durable, testable, and responsibly transmissible. How to read this book safely. This book is intended to inform, not to provoke encounters, and as such, should be read as a historical and theological study of demonology, rather than as a guide to spiritual practice. The material presented here describes beliefs, texts, and traditions. It does not prescribe rituals, techniques, or methods for engaging hostile spiritual forces. Readers are strongly cautioned against extrapolating practice from description. Ancient sources consistently distinguish between knowledge of demons and authority over them. Possessing information, name, classifications, or narratives was never understood as conferring protection. On the contrary, fascination, fixation, and unauthorized engagement are repeatedly portrayed in the historical record as sources of vulnerability rather than insight. This book assumes that spiritual safety is grounded in restraint, moral order, and communal accountability. Readers experiencing fear, distress, or intrusive thoughts related to the subject matter should pause their reading and seek appropriate support, whether that be spiritual, psychological, or both. Demonology has historically been treated as a specialized discipline precisely because it is not benign when approached carelessly. Finally, this work should be read with humility. Not every phenomenon requires a demonological explanation, And not every reference to spirits implies immediate relevance to modern experience. Discernment, not curiosity, is the guiding principle of responsible engagement. If this book encourages caution rather than confidence, it has been read correctly.
Thank you for listening to Southern Demonology. Find us online at southerndemonology.com, where you can find all of our social links, including YouTube, TikTok, and Patreon, in addition to listen to episodes and read their transcripts. Also, if you have a moment, please rate this podcast and share it with friends, as nothing can help us grow more.